Dr. Stephen Hoffenberg is a retired medical doctor, emergency room doctor, and he's having lots of fun now. So he's playing pool. He's a very serious fly fisherman. He's a very long-term map collector, and he has been a member of the Rocky Mountain Map Society probably or so. So he's been around with us for a long time. He's given several presentations. Every time he does, I walk away thinking, you know, that's probably the best presentation I've ever heard. And this presentation he's giving tonight, we got to hear in Texas, I think, wasn't it? At a national conference at the University of Texas, Arlington, which he gave. And I thought it was so terrific. It was quite a few years ago that he's going to give it to us here in Denver. And I think you're going to find this really interesting. But I do want to mention one other fascinating thing about the doctor, and that is his wife. Beverly is not only of appeal to him, but she appeals to all of us because she is a distant relative of Gervais Nolan, who was one of the original fur trappers in Taos and Santa Fe in the 1840s and 50s in our region of where we are. So she really has the real roots in this area. So maybe that's part of where Steve gets his interest. So without further ado, please come on up, Dr. Hoffenberg.
Okay, well, thank you, Wes, for your kind introduction.
I'm turning my cell phone off. So.
Okay, and tonight what the topic is the cartography of the Indian country. And before I get too far into this, I'd like to say the Indian country is not what we're used to thinking of as the state of Oklahoma and the Indian territories. This was a vast area west of the Mississippi, which was created by legislation in 1834 and really encompassed pretty much everything that the U.S. owned west of the Mississippi, exclusive of a couple of states and territories. And we'll show you the maps of this. We're going to talk about the relocation of Indians on both a voluntary basis and forced basis. We're going to look at the political environment that brought about the establishment and the progressive reduction of this Indian country. And all along the way, we're going to look at a rich cartography of the American West. And I have to tell you, for me, maps are a visual representation of history. So I look at maps and I see history. Now, before I get into it, I want to say that there's a lot of terms that I'll be using that, in all honesty, are politically incorrect. They really are incorrect. And that's tribes and American Indians. And I have to tell you, that language comes up again and again in the literature. So I'm going to apologize in advance for that. Now, every journey begins with a step. And my first step on this journey in looking at the Indian country was a map that I actually bought at auction about 15 years ago. And it was a Colton map, finest map of the time. Colton was a tremendous publisher, had the most accurate and current information available. And when I looked at this map, a lot of it looked familiar to me. Obviously the East, but the current borders of Texas, the current borders of California, a large Utah and New Mexico territory, which were correct for the period. But when I looked at the Great Plains, I saw something that was very confusing. Let's see, I saw this oddly shaped Indian territory articulating like a jigsaw puzzle with an oddly shaped Nebraska. And I've never seen those before. So I really wanted to look into that. Now, if I look at a comparable and what I consider correct map from a year later, and you look at the Great Plains, you see a large Nebraska going from the Canadian border to Kansas, Kansas going south to what looks like the current borders of Oklahoma. That was familiar to me. This is a map which is dedicated to the Great Plains and really demonstrates that Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And what I'd like to point out is that Colorado doesn't appear on this map. It would occur right in here. And Colorado, it was kind of carved out of a number of other states and territories. So what you're going to see when you look at this map, beside a huge Nebraska that most Nebraska football fans consider the actual state of Nebraska, Fort Collins would have been in Nebraska. Denver was, in fact, in Kansas. The western slope was in Utah, and southern Colorado was in New Mexico. So it kind of sits right here in that little square, but it doesn't show up at this point. Now, this is a map that I think is very informative. This is a map of the US showing those states and territories as they appeared after these territories, this large landmass was acquired from two sources. One was Mexico in the Mexican-American War. They ceded 500,000 miles to the United States after that war. And out of that came state of California, New Mexico, Utah. Shown here is Texas with its current borders. And all of these territories were carved out of the Compromise of 1850, which we're going to touch on a little bit later. But when you look right in the middle of this, you see this large undefined area. There's not a name on that for that territory. And that was, in fact, Indian country. And I use the term country, very specific. My internet connection is unstable. Okay. And if you look at it in detail, you'll see the names of a number of Indian nations, but again, not a specific territory. So the question is, where did this Colton map come from, this odd yellow submarine shaped Nebraska? What struck me about this is there's no Kansas here. There's only a Nebraska. And you see borders, which are very unusual. You usually don't see borders with this kind of articulated edge. You see straight lines that are negotiated. You see mountain ranges, like in the West. You see rivers, but you don't really see these fingers of land sticking out. So this was unusual, and I wanted to know where that came from. Now, whenever I'm confused about borders, I go to the source. And for me, the source is a Geologic Survey Bulletin, which was first published in 1923. And it's really absolutely definitive for additions to territories, cessions from territories, when a state was formed, when a territory was formed. So I looked up, and it's very useful if you're a map collector, by the way. I looked up the Indian Territory, and what it said, it was set apart by an act of Congress in 1834. It was classified as an unorganized territory. Now, all land that's subject to governance by the United States is either within a state or it's within a territory. Those are the two options. Within territories, there's two kinds of territories, two flavors. One is created by what's called an organic act, where that territory is en route to become a state. And they have a constitution that they draw up. They have locally elected officials governing that territory, and ultimately they'll apply to the Senate to become a state. An unorganized territory is simply land that we control through the US government that's not en route to become a state. There's no locally elected officials, and it's directly governed by the federal government. And this Indian Territory was unorganized. It covered almost all of the West at the time, and the definition that was given was all that part of the United States west of the Mississippi and not within the state of Missouri and Louisiana or the territory of Arkansas shall be taken and deemed to be Indian country. And they use the term Indian country. Now, what that would have looked like is here's Louisiana, not included, Arkansas Territory, not included, and Missouri, not included. But everything west of this Mississippi River right here was Indian Territory. So that was an order of magnitude larger than what we think of as Oklahoma, and that was all Indian country. Now, as it would happen, that never really occurred because the day before they were going to implement this Indian territory, there was other legislation which added to the territory of Michigan everything that was east of the Missouri River. But this is a very accurate depiction of the Indian territory, and it would stay this way for a long time, about 20 years actually. Now, what I want to point out here is west of the Indian territory was either disputed Oregon territory with the British and the Americans both claimed that territory, and this large area held by Mexico. Okay, and this was even before Texas was a republic. So all of this was Mexico in here. And the Indian territory was on the far extreme of our country. So it was out there, and it was viewed as a buffer against the British and a buffer against the Mexicans. So it's very interesting. This was a buffer. They also considered it unoccupied land. Now, if you were an Osage or a Sioux or a Pawnee, I don't think you viewed that as unoccupied land. But if you're sitting in Washington, it was unoccupied and can be used in any way that they chose. Now, get back to the initial question, the puzzle, Nebraska. When did Nebraska actually show up? It was created by the Kansas and Nebraska Act in 1854, and there was never a Nebraska without a Kansas. They were created by the same act, and the northern boundary of Nebraska was the Canadian border. The southern boundary of Kansas was 37 degrees of latitude, and they were divided at the 40th parallel. Okay, now this is a map that's a fabulous map. It actually preceded the silver map that I showed you of the Great Plains, and it was also a Colton, but it wasn't put in an atlas. It was a freestanding map, and it shows a very accurate depiction of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the resulting and remaining Indian territory. So where did this Nebraska come from? Still have the puzzle. Well, with a little bit of research, it turns out that between 1844 and 1854, there were 8 proposed Nebraska territories, and they were all designed to protect and facilitate immigration west. That was along the Oregon Trail, that was along the Santa Fe Trail, and they were all centered on the Platte River. The 6th proposal was by a guy named Richardson from Illinois. It was never passed, it was defeated. And there's no map, but if you read about it, it went west to the Rocky Mountains, south to 3630. And just to let you know, 3630 was a very important latitude because of an earlier Missouri Compromise, which we'll get back to in a minute. And north was 43 degrees. But the most important thing was it said it excluded all lands belonging to Indians that had been guaranteed permanent title until title from the Indians could be secured. So that's pretty strange language. It's theirs in perpetuity, but we got to get it back somehow, okay? And if you map that out, this is one of my favorite maps of the West. It's an 1834 hood, and it really shows you where Native Americans were assigned geographically. And this was really accurate. If you look here, it'll be in the south, it'll be the Choctaw, then the Creek, then the Cherokee and Osage, but also a variety of other Native American groups. And you can see this little finger land sticking out. And if you compare it to that 1852 Monk map, you can see the exact same thing. Didn't change between 34 and 52. You can see this little peninsula of land sticking out. And if you draw lines around all this, this is what you get. And here it's kind of highlighted. These are actually Native American lands that were titled, and you see it here in territory. So that's the answer to the question that I had. And I could just stop right now and you could all go home. But you don't get off quite that easily because we're going to go a little bit deeper into this. So that's where that map came from. So I had lots of questions. How did the Indian country come about? And most interestingly, what were the political pressures? What were the legislative underpinnings? How were lands assigned? How were permanent titles going to be extinguished? And how did the borders evolve? So let's get into it. Now, I need a starting for this discussion. And the starting point actually is going to be the French and Indian War, which was settled by the Treaty of Peace in 1763, at which time the French ceded to the British pretty much all their holdings in North America, not 100%, but 99%. And the English, as part of that Treaty of Peace, established a dividing line at the Appalachian watershed between what they called, interestingly, the Indian country to the west, and they forbid white settlement in the Trans-Appalachian West and created a centralized Indian office. And this was a precedent that was exactly what would be used later in the Trans-Mississippi West. And by the way, it was never fully honored, that part about white people not going to the Trans-Appalachian West. And they were at times forcibly removed by the British. This is a schematic, and it shows an Indian country as well as British colonies on the East Coast. Now, the Revolutionary War was settled in 1783 by the Treaty of Paris. And I want to tell you, the French and Indian War would have been the biggest event in American history were it not for the Revolutionary War. So the Revolutionary War kind of upstaged them a little bit, but the Treaty of Paris settled it. And within that treaty, there were no provisions made to Native Americans. And the majority of Indians had actually sided with the British during the war, because the British held out the promise of an Indian country free of white people. And after the Revolutionary War, Treaty of Paris did not hold that promise out. And Indians that had supported the revolution were treated the same as those that fought with the British. And after the revolution, there was no ban to white settlement across the Appalachians, and they accelerated. Now, I love this map. And by the way, I could say that about pretty much any map I'm going to put up. But this map is very interesting to me. It's a Faden from 1794. And if you look at it, it shows a residua of that Indian country dividing line right here. And if you look at it closer and you look, you can't see it too well, but this line here in the northern part in Kentucky and North Carolina, it says the eastern boundary of the Cherokee. Further south, it says the eastern boundary of the Creek. Also, if you look at it, you see lands reserved for the North Carolina troops, and here lands reserved for the Virginia troops. So troops were going to be paid with land that had previously been Native American land, okay? Now, after the revolution, Indians were no longer needed as allies by the Americans. Indian land was being settled. Wars with the Indians continued both in the Midwest, the Great Lakes area, and in the Southeast in particular. Indians were being concentrated. Cultures were in conflict. Now, that's the state of things at the turn of the century. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson was elected president, and there were two major events that occurred. One of them we all know about, Louisiana Purchase. Everybody knows about that. The second one was the cession of Western lands in the colonies, and in specific, the Georgia cession of Western lands. Now, what happened was, in 1802, Georgia was the last state to give up Western lands. They gave up 2/3 of Georgia. They were paid 3 cents an acre. That was about $1.5 million, by the way. And very importantly, they were given a promise that Indian title to lands within the state of Georgia would be extinguished. No time frame was delineated, and I can tell you, that Native Americans were not a party to the treaty, but they were going to have to leave Georgia. Now, this is another great map. This is a Purcell 1792, and it shows what the colonies looked like. They went from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. And one by one, each of these colonies ceded to the federal government their Western lands. Frankly, they couldn't afford to protect them. They couldn't provide protection. And there were internal conflicts between different states as to who owned what land. And so the resolution was to cede the territory to the federal government. This is a map. It's a Mellish map from 1816. And it shows that the western portion of Virginia became Kentucky, the western portion of North Carolina became Tennessee, the western portion of Georgia became the Mississippi Territory, which later was subdivided into Alabama and Mississippi. So these were the cessions that occurred. Now, when Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase, which was controversial at the time, one of the statements he made was, above all, the best use we can make of the country for some time to come will be to give establishment in it to Indians of the East side of the Mississippi in exchange for their present country. So he said, okay, this is great. We've got these lands with nobody in them. Of course, wasn't true, but we can move Eastern Native Americans into the Louisiana Purchase, and we'll solve a lot of problems by doing that. Now, this is a map. It's a Wilkinson map, 1804. It's the first map that showed Louisiana. And you can see this big Louisiana here. Most of this geography was taken from Arrowsmith mapping. But if you look at it closely, I think what's obvious is they didn't have a clue what was going on in that Louisiana territory. Jefferson didn't know. And by the way, Louisiana was divided into the Orleans Territory and the District of Louisiana. Later, Louisiana will become a state in 1812. And they wanted to explore that area. In 1804, Congress authorized Jefferson to negotiate with Indians to move west of the Mississippi. So I can exchange land now in the east for land in the west, but I can't compel them to do it. There weren't any forced immigrations. So the US now had an opportunity to solve their Indian problem in the East by having Louisiana purchase. They had a precedent which was set by the British, and they had the authority which was granted by Congress at least to exchange lands. Now, Jefferson sent out two exploring parties. One was Lewis and Clark, and they went out to Missouri looking for a route to the Pacific. And the second one was Zebulon Pike, who was sent out to the South to do a couple things. One is Jefferson thought that the Red River may be as important as the Missouri River. It turns out that wasn't the case, but they didn't know that. They hadn't explored it yet. Also to find a route to the Pacific Ocean and take a look at the headwaters of the Red River. And these are the maps that he produced. Now, I'm going to say it again. Are these fabulous maps or what? I mean, these are just great maps. Wes, I've never seen anybody put those two together, but they should, shouldn't they? They actually articulate perfectly. And this map is the logo of the Rocky Mountain Map Society. So that's the Zebulon Pike map right there. And the center of the map was the Arkansas River Valley that was explored by Pike. He stumbled into the Rio Grande Valley where he was arrested by Spanish troops, taken to Santa Fe, where a relative of my wife was asked to interpret on behalf of the government. And it turns out Pike didn't really care much for the guy. And there's another whole story about that. Ask me about it during the break. And then he was subsequently taken to Mexico before being returned to Washington. Now, what he wrote, and I'm going to apologize for the language, but this was what Zebulon Pike wrote. The borders of the Arkansas River Valley may be termed the paradise of our territories for the wandering savages. Of all the countries ever visited by the footsteps of civilized man, there never was one probably that produced game in greater abundance. I believe that there are buffalo, elk, and deer sufficient on the banks of the Arkansas alone, to feed all the savages in the United States for 1 century. So he plotted that land out and said, this is where we're going to send them. And by the way, this runs right through the heart of what was subsequently to become Arkansas and the Indian Territory. Now, there was early movement of Native Americans west. Wars were continuing, particularly northwest and southeast. And a lot of the Native Americans weren't all that happy about living among white people. They wanted to get out. They wanted to maintain their hunting culture. And there were two relocations that occurred early. One was Cherokee relocating west, and the second was Choctaw relocating west. Cherokee in the lands that were ceded by the Osage, and Choctaw in the lands ceded by the Kaw-Paw. Now, just for my curiosity, who's heard of the Kaw-Paw Indians? Okay, Wes has. That's good, Wes. Okay. Now, these are the yeah, okay. These are the ancestral lands of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Osage, and Kaw-Paw. And you can see these are tremendous tracts of land, particularly if you look at the Osage. Now, the Osage ceded land in 1808 to the federal government. They were a historic ally of the French. There were about 5,500 of them at the turn of the century. And in the sessions that were negotiated, they traded for trade goods, trade guarantees, and traded 52 million acres of land for 1,200 in cash and 1,500 in trade goods. And if there's one thing I can guarantee you, they did not understand the deal, because Native Americans had a full understanding of protecting their hunting grounds. They had a full understanding of utilizing the land, but they didn't understand ownership of the land in the same way that British did, the American people. They felt that they belonged to the land rather than the land belonging to them. So I can tell you they didn't fully understand it. Oop, I can't do that. Now, I want to show you these early movements, and I'm going to use a later map. This is a Stephen Long map, and it really shows the Arkansas Valley and the area very well, although it's a little later map. Oops. If I can go back. No, I can't. Is there a way to go back? Okay. Okay, great, great. So here's what happened. The Osage Treaty line was right here. It went from Fort Clark on the Missouri River and dropped straight down to the Arkansas River, then out the Arkansas River. And all this land was ceded to the federal government by the Osage. And that's bigger than the state of Missouri, by the way. That's a tremendous amount of property. Okay, in 1808, coincidentally, same year, a group of Cherokee, a subgroup, said, we'd like to move west. And they were from the lower Cherokee towns, and they were directed to this unoccupied territory that had been ceded by the Osage along the Arkansas and White River. In 1809, the Cherokee went out there, identified lands, and a small subgroup started moving. So the Cherokee were here along the Arkansas River, and the Osage were to the west. By the way, that never worked out real well from the beginning because there was conflict about hunting grounds, to be honest with you. Now, in 1817, there was a larger movement of Cherokee. Again, not a forced immigration, but Cherokee that were just fed up being in the East, exchanged 4 million acres of land and for 4 million in the West, and 5,000 Cherokee moved to what was the Arkansas Territory and created a group called the Western Cherokee. 30,000 remained and were the Eastern Cherokee. And this was the first time that the US government actually exchanged land in the East with land in the West. Now, the Choctaw were primarily in Mississippi and a little bit north, and they were going to move into Kaw-Paw territory. Now, the Kaw-Paw were known as the downstream tribe. They were Siouan speaking. Just like the Osage, they had been military and trading partners of the French. And by 1818, their numbers were drastically reduced. They went from 6,000, which was about what the Osage were, to 500 because of repeated smallpox infections. In the Treaty of 1818, they ceded vast tracts of land, and they settled along the Arkansas and Saline River. And as soon as they did this, white settlers said, okay, the Quapaw are gone, let's move into their land. That turned out to be quite problematic. In 1820, the Choctaw ceded land to the US government. There was a lot of coercion involved. They weren't expressly forced to emigrate, but there was a lot of pressure. And by the way, the land that was ceded wasn't ceded by all the Osage. So a subgroup of Osage cut a deal, but the larger Osage population actually objected to the deal and giving up their land. They exchanged 5.3 million acres east of the Mississippi for lands between the Canadian and Red River. Again, the treaty was contested by many of the Choctaw. White settlers had already moved into lands that the Quapaw had evacuated, and 25% of white Arkansas settlers were in land that they ceded, that they treated to the Choctaw. So this is the situation that we got. We've got this big Arkansas territory. We've got Cherokee here. We've got the Osage here. We've got the Choctaw here and the Quapaw here. The Quapaw really had some prime land. The problem was that the Cherokee and the Osage were battling each other. There was no Western outlet for Cherokee hunters. Whites had settled into land treated to the Choctaw, and white settlers were upset that so much good land went to the Quapaw. By the way, they got 20 square miles per person in this exchange. So they had a lot of land, and it was good land. The resolution was complicated. There's a number of treaties involved, but the result was in 1828, they reduced the Arkansas territory in size. The Choctaw and the Cherokee were moved from the eastern half of Arkansas into what had become unorganized territory in the west that was under direct federal control. White settlers were removed from the what was going to become the Indian Territory. The Osage treaties was renegotiated. They were pushed north, and the Cherokee gained the western outlet for hunting. So this is what it looked like. In 1822, this was the Arkansas Territory, pretty big, okay? And as a result of these treaties, it was reduced in size, and the western portion where the Native Americans were moved actually became unorganized and would later become the Indian Territory. Still hadn't occurred yet. All right, here's one of the bad guys in Indian history, Andrew Jackson. Okay, booing's okay. And Andrew Jackson was a military genius. He was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He fought the Creek Indians. He was the first governor of Florida, but he was a bully and a ruffian. He loved to duel, and he had very clear ideas about Native Americans. When he came into office, he announced very promptly that it was a duty of the government to extinguish titles of Indians to all lands which Congress had included within our territories and states, and that we had an express contract with Georgia to extinguish title. So he was going to take care of that. 3 other events during his time: Indian Removal Act, 1830, Supreme Court ruling, 1832, and the Indian Intercourse Act in 1834. So let's take a look at those. In 1830, the president was authorized to divide territory west of the Mississippi that wasn't in a state or organized territory into districts to receive the Indians. And he was authorized to exchange such district with any tribe residing with any state or territory. So he now had full authority to do forced removals of Indians in the East to unorganized territory in the West. And it allowed not only for removal east of the Mississippi, but it allowed for removal of Native American nations that were in places like Iowa, Missouri, Louisiana. So that's a big deal. 1832, the Cherokees sued the state of Georgia to try and retain their lands. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee possessed a full right to the lands they occupied, and no state could interfere. Andrew Jackson's reported response was, well, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And by the way, that very quote has been brought up by J.D. Vance not too long ago. That's not actually what he said. That was what Horace Greeley, the Go West young man guy, said he said. What he actually said was worse. And what he actually said was, the opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges. And on that point, the president is independent of both. Whoa, okay. So I don't know how to interpret that crowd reaction, but I'm moving on. Okay. In 1834, there was the Everett Report, and that was from a congressman, and it had three components to it. One was to create a Department of Indian Affairs, and that was adopted. The second one was to a bill to regulate trade and commerce with the Indians and, quote, preserve peace on the frontier. That was adopted. And the third was to create a new territory called the Western Territory for the protection of the Native Americans. Now, that one was not adopted. And just to show you what that looked like, remember we looked at that hood map earlier. This accompanied the governmental document. By the way, I love government documents. That's my passion. And it's almost an addiction. And I will not buy any more government documents today, I promise. So, anyway, this map is really one of the best for looking at the lands assigned to the Native Americans. And although this territory never existed, what you find is that it lingered on in later maps. So you can see this territory that wasn't adopted. If we look at an 1846 fabulous Mitchell map of the Western US, you can see that territory kind of lingered on, although that wasn't actually adopted. Now, with this, forced removals underway. Jefferson had envisioned the Western relocation. There were voluntary, maybe a little coerced movement, Cherokee and Choctaw, up to 1825. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act authorized forced removal. And in 1834, they created an Indian country with the Indian intercourse. Okay. Now I'm going to have to figure out how I go back again. Okay. All right. Act. Now, this was the start of the Trail of Tears. This is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. Each tribe has its own unique history, but one by one, they were moved from the east into the west. Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee were the last to go. This was a forced removal. Conditions were miserable. There were shortages of everything, food, blankets. The food that they had was spoiled. They were preyed upon by bandits and roadside merchants, and they were goaded along at a cruel pace. Conservatively, 25% died. It might have been more. And those that arrived in the Indian Territory, cholera, as example, was rampant among the Indians. So they were sick, they were weakened. In 1841, a West Point graduate, Major Ethan Allen Hitchcock, investigated the Trail of Tears, and he found bribery, perjury, short weight, spoiled food. Every subterfuge was employed by designing white men. And of course, since it was a negative report, it was not released. And it was released years later, but it was buried. So with the forced removals, Indians were out of the east. Lands in the east were available for white expansion. Native Americans were concentrated in the West on the periphery of our country. The Indian country was a buffer against the Spanish and the British, and this was the peak of the Indian country. And again, this is what it looked like. We looked at that map earlier. Buffer against Mexico, buffer against the British. So that's the way things were. But that did not last very long at all. In the 1840s, the Santa Fe Trail and the Oregon Trail became rivers of commerce. Oregon was treated with the British just before the Mexican-American War, and the resolution was the current Canadian border. And by the way, before that, it was 5440 or fight, if you've heard the term. We wanted all the way to 5440. It wound up at 49. And the Mexican-American War produced vast amounts of land, 500,000 square miles, New Mexico, Upper California, and Texas. And if that wasn't enough, they found gold in California. So nothing was going to keep people from crossing the country in great numbers. And the Indian Territory, which had been a buffer, was now a barrier to commerce and a problem that the federal government was going to solve. So the solution was clear. Let's create pathways for the Indian territories. 1844, they introduced the first legislation to create a Nebraska territory through the heart of Indian country. And between 44 and 54, as we mentioned, 8 bills were introduced, all centering on the Platte River. The question was not, should we organize new territories and states? It was, how are we going to do it? And I love this map too. And this map was a topographical engineer map by a guy named Emery, very influential guy. And it shows the full extent of the Republic of Texas. And if you can see it, it goes all the way up into current Colorado. And it was the largest expanse. Texans are like Nebraskans, they think big. And in any event, and this actually went right through Colorado. And if you don't believe that, go to Steamboat in the winter on a Sunday. You'll see more Texans than Colorados there. Okay. But what's interesting about this map, it's the first map that had the proposed Nebraska territory on it in 1844. Fabulous map. I love it. Now, I just want to say something. When the U.S. acquired all the lands that included the Republic of Texas, New Mexico, and Upper California, and also resolved issues with the British here, there was a problem that was created. And the problem was, how do we organize all this new land? And by the way, that was about 15% of our land mass, just boom, like that, into states and territories. And this isn't the lecture for it, but they really went through the Compromise of 1850 and created several things. One was a free state of California, no slavery, current borders. Another was a reordered Texas. They ceded a lot of their land to the federal government, which then went into New Mexico, but current borders, Utah and in New Mexico. But if you look at this in 1852, Indian country was absolutely intact. Nothing had changed. Now, there were some heavy duty issues. The federal government said, we got to get through the Indian territory for commerce and trade. We got to organize this. And the two issues that came up were railroads and slavery. The northern states favored opening the Indian country as free territories without slavery and favored a central railroad route. The South favored keeping the territories closed until issues could be resolved favorably. That sounds like a real mañana to me. And they wanted slavery or choice. By the way, that was still prohibited at the time by the Compromise of 1820, which is another subject. They also favored a southern railroad route. route. Now think about this. If the railroad route to the Pacific went through the South, it would go through Texas, but would also go through all the southern states. So it was a real economic driver for what they wanted, along with maintaining a balance in their mind between free and slavery and not having a Senate that was imbalanced. There was a lot of negotiation. Dr. Schulten's an absolute expert on this, by the way, what occurred. But in 1854, the resolution was a Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was a complex negotiation led by Stephen Douglas, and they created two territories at the same time, not one, Kansas and Nebraska. So you can't say the Nebraska, it's a Kansas-Nebraska Act. So they created two territories. The boundary was between them was the 40th parallel. The issue of slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty, which meant that the territories themselves could vote to see whether there would be slave or free. To do that, they had to repeal the Missouri Compromise, which said no slavery above 3630, except for Missouri. That was the Missouri Compromise. And the southern boundary of Kansas was moved from 3630 to 37 because the South hated 3630. That had historical implications that they did not favor. Now, the presumption was that Southerners would develop a pro-slavery Kansas, Northerners would develop a free Nebraska, and balance would be maintained. But that's not what happened. Few Southerners immigrated into Kansas. Abolitionists from the North funded communities in Kansas, and there was ongoing guerrilla warfare between Missouri ruffians and Kansas abolitionist residents. And many regard the raid on Lawrence, Kansas by Missouri ruffians and the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre led by John Brown to be the first shots fired in the Civil War. So the result was, here's Kansas, Nebraska, great Colton map that we've looked at. And we went from this very large Indian territory without internal organization to this highly organized Nebraska and Kansas. And what we see here is an Indian territory, which was still the Indian country, which was left over from Kansas and Nebraska. Now, there was a lot of movement inside of the Indian territory of Native American nations. New nations were added. They moved their boundaries around. So it didn't look exactly the same, but it was the Indian territory. Now, I'm going to make one little digression here because I've been asked about this repeatedly. Where did this panhandle come from? Okay, that's an odd state border. I mean, you don't see that really in any other existing state. And the answer is really not that complicated. The northern border of Texas was 3630. The southern border of Kansas was 37 degrees. That left 30 minutes that weren't accounted for from a latitude point of view. And between 3630 and 37 degrees north of the Texas Panhandle was territory that was not included in any organized territory or state. It was not assigned to any Indian nation, and it was attached as public lands to Indian territory. And this is what that 30-minute panhandle looked like. This was a map from 1899 of what was arguably the Indian Territory. Oklahoma didn't become a state till 1907. And what was interesting in this map to me was that it was really an Indian territory, Oklahoma territory in the west, and in the east was what was called Indian territory, because this became an organized territory, but this portion, which was mostly the 5 Native American nations in the southeast, was left aside. And in 1905, they proposed making this the state of Sequoia, which would preserve a lot of the Indian and indigenous culture here. And interestingly enough, 86% of the Oklahoma population supported making the state of Sequoia. Isn't that interesting? Congress would have none of that. They didn't want two states, they wanted one state. So Sequoia never actually occurred. So that's my run at the Indian country. It's progressive, ceding of territory to other states and territories, and where we wound up today. Now, there's a lot of Native American history that followed that, but that's not the subject of the conversation tonight. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
We do have time for questions. You're so lucky. Aren't you glad you came tonight?
Doctor, when did that little neutral land get attached to Oklahoma?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. The land became attached actually when it became a territory. Okay, the question was, when did the panhandle get attached to the territory? It just sat there on its own for a while without any attachment. But when Oklahoma became a territory, which was 1890, I believe, they went ahead and attached that area called public land or no man's land to the Oklahoma Territory. And when Oklahoma became a state, it was part of the state.
This is fabulous. Clarifying so much confusion I had from 1810 to the 1840s. So you mentioned the several Nebraska bills leading up to the one that passed.
Right.
In all of those earlier iterations, was Douglas and or his allies negotiating about popular sovereignty? Because the reason I ask is that when that passes in January, or when it's introduced in January 54, all hell breaks loose in the North. And so almost the assumption was, how dare you repeal the Missouri Compromise? But you're sort of suggesting that there had been all kinds of intriguing negotiations in the decade leading up to that.
I'm suggesting it. I don't know. Okay, the question is, was there negotiation prior to the Kansas-Nebraska Act that addressed things like popular sovereignty and the borders? And, I haven't read the congressional records, but everything I've read about it says that, yeah, they were negotiating actively. And it was one of the most controversial periods. I mean, people were about ready to kill each other in the Senate. I mean, someone had a pistol drawn on him on the floor of the Senate. I mean, it was a very contentious debate. And most of that was surrounding slavery versus free. And so, yeah, they had talked about popular sovereignty because that had been negotiated initially in the Compromise of 1850. So it was actually, I think that's when most of the real violence or threatened violence occurred. But Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory were the first ones to allow the concept of popular sovereignty when the citizens of those areas could actually vote whether they want to be free or slave. Then it was carried over to Kansas, Nebraska.
But it doesn't generate any controversy in 1850, I think largely because of the climate. But it seems like Kansas-Nebraska Act is explicitly repealing what they call that sacred compact of the Missouri Compromise. So it feels, in the North, it is treated as much more of a betrayal. It's just very interesting to have the same principle create such different outcomes.
Questions about this should be addressed to Dr. Schulten, by the way.
We have a couple questions. We're going to interrupt the floor and read a couple.
Okay, so Karen wanted to know, what is historic 3630 and why was it so hated? Why was it hated?
Okay, and that's why was it so hated? It to the South, a blockage ability of a state or territory to become a slave state or territory. They never liked it. They always wanted the ability of those states and territories to decide for themselves or simply to allow slavery. And 3630 was the border for the Missouri Compromise, with the exception of the state of Missouri, which was north of that. And so that's why it was so hated.
Great, thank you. Karen also said, sad but fascinating layout of the territorial pushback of the Native Americans. Excellent use of old maps to lay out history. And then Larry says, excellent presentation. What was the reference book he mentioned early in the presentation?
Okay, if I can find it, because I don't know how to go back exactly. Here we go. No. It's actually a USGA book. I know it's document 817. Let's see if we can find it, and we'll show it on here. This is not an easy way to do this, by the way.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'm gonna get there. There it is. So boundaries and areas and geographic centers and altitudes of the United States and several states. Department of Interior, document 817. And I would bet that if you went, you know, on the internet, you could find a copy of that without too much difficulty.
Excellent, thank you.
Katie?
I was wondering if the
Kim Moore?
American tribes.
I'm asking Bill to type because I don't know how.
Okay. All right, I'm sorry, Katie.
No, that's okay. I was wondering if the Native American tribes had any communication between tribes and if they ever tried to work together to, fight off the removal.
The answer is yes. And in fact, who was was it Tecumseh, the Shawnee Indian that tried to organize the Native Americans? Does anybody know?
Yes.
Okay, someone said yes. I appreciate that. I mean, yeah, he traveled all over and communicated with various tribes and tried to create a single Indian nation. It wasn't successful in that, but yeah, they did communicate.
They knew what happened to the other ones to sort of.
The question is, what could they do about it? I don't know who answered yes, but thank you.
We have a question online from Bill Gurnett who wants to speak, and perhaps that was Bill Gurnett, or perhaps that device works. So
go ahead, Bill, if you can speak.
I can hear you. Well, not a question, but a comment. When Andrew Jackson was removing the Creeks, they were not savages. They were not hunters. They were, in fact, one of the 5 civilized tribes, and they were farmers, and they wore European clothes, and they were, other than being Indians, they were indistinguishable from the locals. Problem was, they had discovered gold in western Georgia in significant amounts, significant enough that they put a mint there, and they decided that the gold should belong to the Europeans, not to the civilized tribes. So yet again, we were not as modern as perhaps we would hope that we would have been.
I would agree with everything that you said.
More questions? Let's thank our speakers